Now, in terms of the state of emergency, each of you know that that expires on the 13th of September. The Public Health and Wellbeing Act, an act of the Victorian Parliament, provides for a maximum of 6 months for the running of that state of emergency. You can only operate and function for 6 months. That is the legal instrument that allows, for instance, rules about face masks, rules about COVID-safe work plans in large workplaces and small. That's the legal instrument that, for instance, sits behind density limits in pubs and restaurants and cafes, or things like a positive person, someone who's got this virus, being required to isolate at home. So we simply can't have those important rules and the legal framework that sits behind them. We can't have that end on the 13th of December because this virus won't have ended by the 13th of next month. The important thing here is that before the 13th of September, and I'll leave it to that working group to determine exactly how and the presiding officers when the Parliament will sit, but we will extend the state of emergency provisions within the Public Health and Wellbeing Act for a maximum of a further 12 months. So that means it'll be a total of 18 months, the 6 months that we've already been through, plus a further 12 months. There are a few other minor changes, but again, that bill will be made available at the appropriate time. I think we're going to engage with all parties in the Victorian Parliament quite soon to talk about those changes, and hopefully we can both have a very important agreement about how and when the Parliament sits, and then we can have an orderly process to make those necessary changes. That doesn't relate to the state of disaster. That doesn't relate to the rules, many of them that we are living under right now, but it is about making sure that even after the worst of this, the second wave has passed, there will still be, for a considerable period of time, it could be less than another 12 months, we'd certainly hope so. If a vaccine was to appear next year, well then many of those rules would not be needed. But we have to assume that that vaccine won't be here, and that there will be some rules like how many people can go to a restaurant, wearing face masks, COVID-safe work plans in workplaces, and the need for people, as a matter of law, if you've got this, you need to be at home away from other people. Those sorts of rules are all a product of the state of emergency, and the provisions within the Public Health and Wellbeing Act need to be changed to reflect the fact that whilst we'd all love this to be over by the 13th of September, which is when the Act says the state of emergency must end, that's just not going to be the case. We're going to have this with us for a considerably longer period than that. Just before I ask Jenny to speak to the next announcement we have, which is a comprehensive dashboard of data at a local government level, lots of different data, more than has ever been, I think, produced. It's all about trying to make sure that the community has the most complete picture, and arguably that data, that important information will become even more critical once we get beyond this second wave and we begin to open up. Knowing about a case in a given setting, knowing about an outbreak in a part of Melbourne or part of regional Victoria will arguably be more important when we've got so many people moving around, as we will have once these restrictions are eased. That public information and the ability to be able to call upon people to come forward and get tested, for instance, that'll be even more important, not so much in this phase, but once we get beyond it, it'll be very important. So Jenny's got the beginnings of that. That'll be up later on this afternoon, and then that will be added to over time with more and more data sets for the Victorian community, either by going to the website and looking at it directly, or indeed in terms of the reporting that each of you will no doubt do. Can I just...
Tomorrow marks 14 days since the re-emergence of COVID-19 beyond our quarantine facilities. In those almost 2 weeks, enormous effort has gone into rolling out our resurgence plan. You can see that in the sheer scale of the response. And I want to briefly recap on that response, because in sharing those details, it gives a sense of why we are well equipped to deal with the cases that will continue from this current cluster for some time to come. Since Wednesday, 12 August, we have tested more than 100,000 Aucklanders and 194,000 in total across the country. That is more than a quarter of all the testing New Zealand has done for COVID since the beginning of the year in just the last 13 days. on contact tracing, where we find all the people someone with COVID-19 might have come into contact with, we have reached the gold standard of reaching 80% of contacts within 48 hours since the 12th of August. That's a sign we are getting ahead of the virus and are finding people and making sure they are in isolation before they are even symptomatic. In fact, that is exactly what has happened in the majority of our positive cases. And on contact tracing generally, I do want to make mention of the remarkable efforts of our Auckland Public Health Unit. At the end of last week, I spoke with Sir Brian Roche about what he had seen firsthand while visiting our Auckland Public Health Unit. He was there to see if they had all they needed to do their incredibly important job. He said he found watching them a humbling experience, and I've seen that from afar. I've seen them go back to patients with COVID once, twice, 3 times, if that's what it takes to help find close contacts. They have used CCTV footage, hop cards, swipe cards, dockets, whatever it takes to help them establish people's movements and help keep other people safe. They are the ones that have to tell people they have COVID-19 and then work through all of the anxiety that creates to help them build a picture of every move someone has made over a 14-day period. Not only do they do incredible work, they do a job that has been supported by our level 3 restrictions. We have seen in recent days cases emerge that happened before level 3 came into force. They have shown us how tricky this virus is. They have happened on a bus journey between absolute strangers. We have seen a case we believe occurred through a retail shopping experience, many cases through churches. If it weren't for level 3, this cluster would be exponential. Of that, I have no doubt. This is a contained cluster, but it is our biggest one. And that means the tail will be long, and the cases will keep coming for a while to come. You might remember that it took us over 12 weeks to close our largest cluster in our first wave. But we can manage that. What we need to do, though, is put ourselves in the best long-term position to manage it successfully and in the most contained way we can. Ultimately, our goal needs to be managing this cluster eventually from level 2 as soon as we feel confident we can do that. That means feeling confident we have the perimeter of the cluster well understood and defined and are not seeing too many cases cropping up that we haven't found through contact tracing. Based on the advice of the Director General, we believe that confidence can be built over the course of this week. That is why the Director General has recommended to Cabinet, and Cabinet has agreed to apply a short extension of level 3 restrictions in Auckland until 11:59 p.m. this Sunday, 30 August. You may recall we were due to lift restrictions on Wednesday. These extra 4 days are believed necessary to allow us to move down a level in Auckland and stay down. We want both confidence and certainty for everyone. We also agree with the Director General's view that, as we did before, that Auckland should step its way into level 2. That means from midnight on Sunday, schools, hospitality, retail, and those entities that are all able to operate at level 2, they all reopen. But we will keep a limit on mass gatherings. That means groups of no more than 10, with the exception of tangihanga and funerals, which you will recall occurred with up to 50 people the last time we stepped into level 2 gradually. The rest of the country will maintain the current level 2 settings. We will put these settings in place for 1 week from Sunday and review them before Sunday, the 6th of September. So just to review again, we will be keeping in place the current settings for Auckland until 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. From there, we will then move into level 2 for Auckland, with the exception of mass gatherings that will be limited to 10, unless you are attending a tangihanga and a funeral where 50 will able to be applied. As for the rest of New Zealand remaining at level 2, I do want to share the rationale for keeping New Zealand at that level. Many will argue that given we haven't seen cases elsewhere, the rest of New Zealand should see a lift in current restrictions. I absolutely understand the sentiment that sits behind that, and it does make sense, except for one issue, and that is regional travel. There are many people and businesses who will want to enter and leave Auckland once it is at level 2 from Sunday night, and many others who want to see the benefit that comes from our biggest city moving around the country again. That includes, for instance, hospitality or retailers. But with that movement does come risk, so there is a choice to be made. If we want the economic benefit of regional travel, the trade-off is keeping in place the social distancing and mass gathering limits that help keep everyone safe in the meantime. It's a finely balanced decision, but the right one, I believe, when inter-regional borders, they just don't work when the restrictions start reducing. And finally, I want to speak to some of the activity over the week ahead. We continue to ask everyone who is on public transport and planes to wear a mask or face covering. Given the recent transmission we have seen on this form of transport, Cabinet has decided to move to mandating the wearing of face coverings on public transport for level 2 and above. These new orders will come into force from Monday. This isn't a decision we took lightly, but we know masks protect you and the people around you, and we now have a real-life example of that. They limit the chance of COVID-19 spreading in places where it is often harder to distance yourself and to trace people. In the meantime, we again urge everyone in Auckland to wear face coverings in public generally, as we've continued to urge over the past week. And finally, I've been asked whether the government or New Zealand's strategy should change when it comes to taking on COVID-19. The answer is no. As I look around the world and at the experience of others, we are still of the view that now, more than ever, a stamp-it-out strategy is best for our people and for our economy, for the long-term well-being of New Zealand. That means every time we see cases, we act, we test, we trace, we isolate, and we repeat as many times as we need. And we work incredibly hard to limit the impact of COVID on everyone. That does not mean heavy restrictions every time we see a case. In fact, our ongoing goal has to be to maintain our elimination strategy while trying to reduce the impact on as many people and businesses as possible. But there is no denying that the price Aucklanders are currently paying is the greatest. I want to say that even though many of us haven't been in the city or haven't experienced the second round of level 3, we know it's been tough. I know there are many who have found it harder this time. In part, I imagine the reminder that this is the world's reality and that COVID is ever present is part of that. It is a hard reality to accept. Now, we may not have any choice about whether or not the world is in a global pandemic, but we do have choices around how we deal with it. We have made a choice, and we have a clear plan that means we can get through however long this pandemic is in the world and keep as much normality, including for our economy, as possible. We have done that for 6 months already, and we can keep doing it. The next 7 days, in fact, the next several weeks, we'll see more cases, but it will also see thousands of tests, hundreds of workers contact tracing, a team out in full force to stamp out COVID-19 in New Zealand. And I hope it will also see everyone playing their part, staying home if they're sick and getting a test, downloading the COVID Tracer app, keeping a log of everywhere they go and everyone they're with, washing their hands, being kind. In our fight against this virus, we have held some records. Now the one we have to beat is around resurgence. And if any one country knows how to bounce back, it is us. This has been a hard year. It's been a hard year for Christchurch, who has fresh reminders of that this week. It's been a hard year for Auckland, It's been a hard year for drought-stricken and flood-ridden parts of the country. So if it feels hard right now, it's because it is. But let's also remember, in a world where 2020 has frankly been terrible, we are strong, we have been kind, and we are doing really well. I'm happy to take questions. Jessica and then Toba.
With the mask wearing, do you regret not making it mandatory on some forms of public transport earlier, because that would have stopped the prevention, perhaps, say, on the bus example?
To ensure that those facilities remain safe for both staff and, of course, other patients to use and for visitors. Yesterday, our laboratories completed 4,589 tests, a low number which we do see on a Sunday, and this brings the total number of tests completed to date to 697,070. And in the last 7 days, our labs have processed almost 100,000 tests for COVID-19. I'd like to sincerely again thank not just those carrying out the testing, the swabbing in the community, our excellent laboratory staff, but also all New Zealanders who have come forward to be tested as part of our efforts to find every case we have in the community. And just a reminder, people with symptoms that are consistent with COVID-19 should seek advice from their GP or Healthline about getting a test. And on to the New Zealand COVID Tracer app. There are now more than 1.77 million people who have registered to use the app, representing around 43% of the adult population that is over age 15. It's very encouraging to see this uptake continue to increase, and it's great that New Zealanders are clearly aware of the importance of keeping a record of their movements to assist our contact tracing efforts. And the recent cases have shown us that the ability to be able to rapidly trace and contact and isolate people who may have been in contact with infected people is key to us stamping out any outbreaks like this that do occur. It's been well over 1 million scans every day in the past 7 days using the app. There are now 313,119 QR codes that have been created, and the number of QR codes being generated each day is starting to tail off over the last 3 days, indicating that it seems almost every New Zealand business or other premise that is required to have a code now has one in place.
Whether or not I regret that decision not being made, say, back in February or March, I do think it's fair to say the whole world has continued to learn, and New Zealand is one of those countries where we've seen new evidence. We've always been willing to act on that, and we are. But it is fair to say we've continued to learn lessons and make improvements all the way through COVID-19.
Last time we went from level 3 to level 2, we had almost a week of very low case numbers. We had 3 days in a row of 0. Why do we only need to extend it by 4 days? And are you confident we'll get down to those low levels again? Why is it different this time?
Yeah, and of course it's what we look for, and those links to our existing cluster is what we continue to look for. And so our strategy has not changed. And of course you'll see from the alert level framework, we do talk about managing cases within that part of our system, all about making sure they're linked. We're seeing those connections between cases. We have confidence we'll be able to build that certainty over the next 7 days.
What could prevent a shift down alert levels on Sunday?
Again, anything that demonstrates exponential growth outside of our cluster and cases outside of the cluster that we really struggle to link on a larger scale. Over the course of this cluster, we've continued to see a pattern that we expected. We've continued to be able to build links over time to the existing cases. But what we need to prepare ourselves for is, because this is a larger outbreak, a larger cluster than usual, we will see a longer tail or a bigger tail than usual. And in part, that'll just be because there are more people connected to it. I always want to base both the changes that we make and, of course, the decisions we take based on evidence. And we will keep looking for the evidence of what happened here. It's in our interest to do that. We want to learn from it. But regardless, we are tightening up constantly in our COVID response, everything we do to try and make sure we affect as few people as possible anytime we have future cases. Well, actually, we've encouraged mask use all the way through for Aucklanders generally when they are outside their homes. We've encouraged it generally for everyone for public transport. Now what we're saying is that we'll be mandating face coverings for public transport then from Monday. Ultimately, though, we're not mandating a singular type of mask mask. It is a face covering. So as long as people are making efforts to cover their face, we encourage that they look up advice on the best forms of that. That will then satisfy that order. Yeah.
How do you enforce the mask?
Yeah, how we enforce the mask. Well, of course, some people will ask, why aren't we doing it generally? We have chosen an area where it is easier to enforce, of course, as you're entering and exiting public transport. And, of course, we are including Uber in that as well. Of course, it's easy to see whether or not someone has a face covering and whether they'll therefore be able to come on the bus.
So they won't be able
or train.
So they won't be able to catch public transport without a mask.
It will be mandated. Entry will be mandated at level 2 or above on someone having a face covering. We're working now through the orders. Cabinet's given enough time for Crown Law and Parliamentary Council Office to draft those orders by Monday, but we want to give fair warning to people that that's the expectation we have. Do you know, I think people will see the cases that we have. We have several cases now where people have become unwell from a bus journey. And so this is a common sense approach to protect everyone's health. We did consider whether or not the rest of the country moved to level 1, but of course it becomes very difficult to enforce then anyone from Auckland coming into level 1 areas and not participating in mass gatherings. So it's the enforceability issue. Keep in mind that Auckland is going to come out of level 3 restrictions. Once it comes into level 2, you wouldn't want a farcical situation where Aucklanders are able to travel across the country to go to large events and large gatherings, because we do still want to manage that risk in Auckland. Having a regional boundary around Auckland where the police check every single person who's leaving to ask them whether they're going to a mass gathering is just not workable. And so the alternative, the trade-off, is that we keep inter-regional travel, but we all stay at level 2, and that is the trade-off.
A bit of vigilantism.
Yeah.
We saw a bit of vigilantism during lockdown level 4. Are you concerned that the public might try and enforce the mask wearing themselves?
Look, of course, I hope that doesn't occur. And so what we will do is obviously work with our public transport operators around making sure that we just manage as best we can enforcement around face coverings. It is ultimately there for everyone's safety, but I just ask other users of public transport to have faith that we will enforce it and that they therefore don't need to. If they want to make an offering of a face covering to another passenger, by all means, and that's the kind of support I'd like to see.
Undue pressure on the bus drivers to try and police their spaces.
Yeah, and that's something that we need to make sure that we're really careful about how we manage that. We don't want to put them in a difficult position. The best way to prevent them being in a difficult position is everyone to take responsibility for their own face covering when they arrive to use public transport.
If someone gets on a public transport without a mask, is it the bus driver or the Uber driver?
Yeah.
Or the person?
And so these are some of the issues around enforcement that will be, Cabinet's made the decision. They've given those 7 days for Crown Law and also for the Parliamentary Council Office to draft the orders. That will then help us with any issues around liability and enforcement. But generally, this is falling on the individual to make sure they're complying, but equally, question particularly for Uber around their ability to stop passage for someone if they're not wearing one. So that's what we'll be working through.
Be extending the wage subsidy to go with this small extension?
Yeah, so what we will do, of course, we've already got the 2 weeks covered for the wage subsidy. That remains as it is. What individuals who previously may not have been eligible for the 8-week extension will be able to count this full period of level 3 as part of their application for that extension. So we more likely see more people eligible when they take into account that full period of restrictions.
Prime Minister.
I'll just leave it in, and then I'll let Trevor finish, and then I'll come to you.
How heavily did the economic impacts weigh on you when Cabinet made this decision today?
Always. We are constantly keeping in mind the cost to business, the cost to the Auckland economy, but equally we have to keep in mind the wider costs if we make a premature decision that doesn't give enough certainty that we can come out and we can then stay out. We've learnt that lesson well before, so we want this to be as short a period as possible, but also one where we can have certainty, we can move with confidence. Well, if you look at the weekly impact on the economy, which has been in the hundreds of millions, here we've made a decision around a 4-day increase versus the potential that you come out prematurely without the full confidence that we have the cluster and the full perimeter of that cluster well understood. You then run the risk of going into another transmission cycle.
Was any analysis actually done of the potential costs and benefits and productions?
Well, in order to do that, you would have to be able to fully appreciate the likely behaviour of the cluster, and that has been where it's been difficult. Some estimates have been made around the size of these clusters, but there's been a lot of caveats around modelling for clusters that make it very hard to make those calls. So we'd have to make some assumptions first about the behaviour of our largest cluster, then assumptions around if we came back in, how long we would be in for. I do think it's commonly appreciated, though, that the idea of yo-yoing, not least because of the uncertainty that gives a regional economy, is very, very unsettling for an economy and comes with a high price.
So you're saying the Treasury said it was just too hard to model the cluster movements and therefore they didn't give you any...
No, I'm saying that health have always caveated, and those around health epidemiologists have always caveated assumptions around clusters, and that Treasury certainly haven't gone to the point of trying to take uncertain cluster modelling to then make assumptions around whether or not we might have resurgence that might take us back in.
So did you ask them to do any analysis?
We know what the weekly cost is to the Auckland economy. It's in the hundreds of millions, so we can make a fair assessment that's saying, well, we'll take ourselves for an extra 4 days, which, keep in mind, takes in two business days and 2 retail business days, versus the potential of extending into a full transmission cycle.
That line call on masks, did you take into account the sort of vitriol that has come out of places like the USA for people not wanting to wear them?
Yeah. To be fair, I didn't consider. So the line call for us was level 3 and level 1 for the rest of the country, not so much masks. On masks, Cabinet was very, very clear. We weren't concerned around people's response generally to mask use, in part because we have a very clear link to public transport and transmission. And so I think New Zealanders, we are pragmatic. We are common sense. If COVID has been spread on a bus and we know masks make a difference, let's wear masks. We did have a conversation about this because we get this feedback through our MPs as well. This is a really good opportunity for me to remind everyone, if you check in on the COVID-19 website, you'll see that there is a list of permitted travel in and out of Auckland. It includes personal circumstances where you don't need an exemption, you are able to travel, and it gives a list of just some evidence you can carry with you to make it easier when you talk with someone at the checkpoint. It also includes a list of reasons or areas where you can move between Auckland and other areas for work purposes. Now, that list of exemptions means you do not have to get an individual permission from the Ministry of Health to travel. So if you check the website, you will see the list. It is reasonably significant and comprehensive. If you are on that list, you can carry evidence and travel. You don't have to wait for any permission to be processed. The reason I wanted to point that out is because there is a percentage of requests coming into the ministry that do not require permission at the moment, and they'll be getting caught up in the system. Please do check that list. It's updated frequently. If we see a lot of requests coming through the same area, the Director General of Health will take a look at it and add it to the class exemptions, which means that we can speed up the movement of people coming through. I'll give you a follow-up. Is there anything specific from people particularly that are coming through?
Just, so you're expecting until Sunday that,
yes.
Or are you hoping that that will ease?
I am hoping we'll get more efficiency around that, because as I say, where we see a large number of applications, we then make a common sense decision around whether they should just have a class exemption. Then it's enough for them to carry a letter from their employer.